In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a blood-stained biscuit tin shocks the community, unraveling a web of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, digs beneath the village's calm facade. A nervous widow, a scarred gardener, a nosy spinster, and a tin that speaks of murder. Each clue leads closer to a hidden truth. From whispered gossip to a chilling confession, follow Miss Marple as she unravels a tale of guilt, revenge, and betrayal in this Agatha Christie mystery. Will the quiet ever return, or will the blood on the biscuit tin stain the village forever? Chapter 1. The Village whispers in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with hawthorn and the church bells chimed with comforting regularity. Life unfolded at a gentle pace, much like the seasons themselves. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and ivy-clad walls, stood as sentinels of tradition, their windows winking in the soft autumn light. It was a place where secrets were seldom spoken aloud, but often whispered behind lace curtains, where every glance and gesture carried weight, and where Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and sharper mind, observed it all from her modest drawing room at Mead Cottage. On this particular October afternoon, the air held a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, and the leaves, in shades of amber and russet, drifted lazily onto the cobbled paths. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as a metronome. Her hands, though aged, moved with the precision of youth, crafting a pale blue shawl for her nephew Raymond's newborn. The room was warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth, and the faint scent of lavender lingered from a bowl of potpourri on the sideboard. A tray of tea things awaited her guest, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, who was due any moment. Her visits always heralded by a flurry of news and indignation. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on tea or knitting, but on the peculiar tidbit that had reached her ears that morning. The village was abuzz with a most unsettling discovery. A biscuit tin, of all things, had been found in the church hall, its lid smeared with what appeared to be blood. The news had come via Mrs. Bantry, who had telephoned at breakfast, her voice trembling with excitement. "Jane, it's positively gruesome," she had exclaimed. "Mrs. Baker found it after the Women's Institute meeting. Blood, Jane, on a biscuit tin." Miss Marple had listened patiently, her mind already sifting through possibilities. Blood, she knew, was not a substance to be dismissed lightly, especially in a village where the most scandalous event of late had been the theft of Mrs. Price's prize marrow. As the clock struck 4, the front door rattled, and Mrs. swept in, her hat slightly askew and her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk. She was a stout woman with a penchant for dramatic entrances, her eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. "Jane," she cried, collapsing into an armchair, "have you heard? It's dreadful. Human blood, they say, on that wretched tin. In the church hall, of all places." She fanned herself with a handkerchief, though the room was hardly warm enough to warrant it. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured tea, her movements calm and deliberate. "Now, Elspeth," she said, her voice soft but firm, "let us not get ahead of ourselves. Tell me precisely what you know, and leave nothing out." She handed her friend a cup, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, ready to pass fact from embellishment. Mrs. McGillicuddy took a sip, then launched into her tale. The biscuit tin, she explained, had been discovered the previous evening by Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, who had stayed late to tidy the church hall after the Women's Institute meeting. It was an ordinary tin, the sort used for digestive biscuits, with a faded floral pattern and a slightly dented lid. Mrs. Baker had thought little of it at first, assuming it belonged to one of the members, until she noticed the dark, sticky smear across the top. She screamed, "Jane!" Mrs. McGillicuddy said, her voice rising, dropped it right on the floor. The biscuits scattered everywhere, but they were untouched, thank goodness. Just plain digestives, nothing sinister there. But the It's chilling. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. "And what did Mrs. Baker do next?" she asked. "She ran straight to P.C. Hurst," Mrs. McGillicuddy replied. "He took the tin to the station, and they've sent it off for analysis. But the village is in an uproar. Some say it's a prank, those wretched boys from the council estate. No doubt, but others think it's something darker. Mrs. Clement says it's a sign of moral decay, and Miss Hartnell swears it's connected to that new woman, Mrs. Langston. You know how she is, always sniffing out scandal." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Mrs. Vera Langston, the widow who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a month ago, taking up residence in Rose Cottage. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, with a wardrobe of expensive hats, and a manner that suggested both charm and secrecy. The village had wasted no time in dissecting her past. Her husband, a wealthy London financier, had died suddenly the previous year, leaving her a considerable fortune. Whispers of foul play had followed her, though nothing was proven. Miss Marple, who had a knack for recalling parallel cases, thought of a woman in her youth, a governess, who'd inherited unexpectedly after her employer's demise. The circumstances had been murky then, too. "Has anyone claimed the tin?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively mild. "Not a soul," Mrs. McGillicuddy said. "Mrs. Price, the WI chairwoman, says it wasn't there when the meeting started. She's certain of it, and no one saw it placed on the table. It's as if it appeared out of thin air." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Nothing appears out of thin air, Elspeth. Someone placed it there, and for a reason. Who was at the meeting?" Mrs. McGillicuddy ticked off the names on her fingers. "The usual lot. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. Miss Hartnell, of course, always poking her nose in. Mrs. Price, running the show. Young Lucy Islesborough, who helped with the tea. And Mrs. Langston, though she arrived late and left early. Oh, and Mrs. Weatherby was there, but she's so deaf. She wouldn't notice a cannon going off." Miss Marple made a mental note of the names, her mind already weaving connections. Lucy Islesborough, a bright young woman with a practical streak, was a newcomer to the WI, but had quickly won the villagers' approval with her efficiency. Mrs. Clement was kind but easily flustered. Miss Hartnell was a busybody with a rigid sense of morality, and Mrs. Price was meticulous but prone to overlooking small details. Mrs. Langston, however, stood out, a woman with a past that invited speculation. And then there was the blood. Human blood, if Mrs. McGillicuddy's sources were correct, was no trivial matter. It suggested violence, or, at the very least, intent. "I think," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair, "that I shall take a walk to the church hall. It's always best to see things for oneself." Mrs. McGillicuddy looked alarmed. "Jane, you're not getting involved, are you? It's a matter for the police." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The police have their methods. Elspeth and I have mine. A biscuit tin, even one with blood, is a curious thing. It tells a story, if one knows how to read it." The church hall stood at the edge of the village green, a squat stone building, with a pitched roof and a notice board plastered with flyers for jumble sales, choir rehearsals, and the upcoming harvest festival. Miss Marple approached it with her usual unhurried gait, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, though the sky was clear. The hall was empty, save for Mrs. Price, who was sweeping the floor with vigorous strokes, her face set in a frown of disapproval. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price exclaimed, pausing her work. "I suppose you've heard about the tin. It's upset everyone. I can't think how it got here. I checked the hall before the meeting, and there was nothing on that table." Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, taking in the polished wooden floor, the rows of chairs, and the long table where the tin had been found. "You're certain it wasn't there at the start?" she asked. "As certain as I am of my own name," Mrs. Price said. "We set out the tea things, cups, saucers, the lot, and that table was clear. I'd have noticed a tin, especially one with, well, you know." She shuddered. Miss Marple stepped closer to the table, her gaze lingering on its surface. A faint ring of dust, barely visible, circled a spot near the edge. "It was placed here recently, then," she murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Price. "After the meeting began, perhaps." Mrs. Price frowned. "But who would do such a thing, and why? It's not as if we're a hotbed of crime in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Villages, Mrs. Price, are not so different from cities. People are people, and where there are people, there are secrets." She thanked Mrs. Price and stepped outside, her mind turning to the attendees of the meeting. Someone, she reasoned, had brought the tin ore, placed it there deliberately. But why a biscuit tin? It was such an ordinary object, yet its ordinariness made the blood all the more striking. It was, she thought, like a stage prop in a play, designed to draw attention. As she walked back toward Dame Mead Cottage, Miss Marple passed Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Langston lived. The garden was immaculate, tended by Tom Blake, a quiet man who'd recently returned to the village after years in London. He was trimming the hedges, his movements precise but mechanical, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple paused, noting the faint scars on his hands' old cuts, perhaps from gardening, or perhaps not. She recalled a case from her youth. A gardener who'd been dismissed for theft and later returned to settle a score. Tom, she knew, had worked for Mrs. Langston's late husband. Was there a connection? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The biscuit tin was a puzzle, and puzzles, she knew, were solved not by rushing but by observing. She thought of Mrs. Langston's guarded demeanour, Miss Hartnell's nosiness, Lucy's sharp eyes, and Tom's scarred hands. Each was a piece, but the picture was not yet clear. She sipped her tea, her eyes distant, already anticipating her next step. A visit to Rose Cottage, where secrets, like ivy, might cling to the walls. The village, meanwhile, continued its chatter. At the post office, Mrs. Baker recounted her discovery. To anyone who'd listen, her voice rising with each retelling. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement fretted over the disruption to the harvest festival, while Miss Hartnell declared the tin a sign of divine judgment. And at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Langston sat alone, her fingers tracing the edge of a similar tin, her face pale and her thoughts unreadable. Miss Marple, however, saw beyond the gossip. She saw a village where every smile hid a story, every gesture a clue. The blood on the biscuit tin was not an end, but a beginning, and she intended to follow it to its source, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 2. The tin's provenance. The morning after Mrs. McGillicuddy's breathless visit, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but held off, as if savouring the suspense. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather's indecision, donned her tweed coat and sturdy shoes, her umbrella tucked under her arm like a faithful companion. Her destination was the church hall, where the mysterious biscuit tin had been found, its lid stained with what was rumoured to be human blood. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath the surface of village life, knew that objects, even as mundane as a biscuit tin, often carried stories more intricate than their appearance suggested. The church hall stood at the edge of the village, green, its stone walls weathered but resolute, much like the villagers themselves. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and faintly of the lavender scones served at the Women's Institute meeting 2 nights prior. Miss Marple found Mrs. Price, the WI chairwoman, arranging hymnals for the upcoming harvest festival. Her movements were brisk, but her face betrayed a lingering unease, as if the tin's discovery had left a shadow over her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but laced with purpose. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Mrs. Price looked up, her broom pausing mid-sweep. "Oh, Miss Marple, not at all. Though I dare say you'll hear about that dreadful tin. It's turned the village upside down." She set the broom against a chair, her hands smoothing her apron as if to steady herself. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the hall. The long table where the tin had been found stood near the window, its surface now scrubbed clean. "I understand it was quite a shock," she said. "You mentioned yesterday that the table was clear before the meeting began. Could you walk me through that evening? Every detail matters, you know." Mrs. Price sighed, settling into a chair. "Well, I arrived early, as always, to set up. The hall was tidy, the table bare except for the tea things we laid out later. Lucy Islesborough helped with the cups and saucers, and Mrs. Clement brought the scones. The meeting started at 7, and we were all there: Mrs. Clement, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Weatherby, Lucy, and Mrs. Langston, though she was late, as usual. We discussed the harvest festival, the jumble sale, and the new hymnals. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, after everyone left, Mrs. Baker stayed to tidy up and found that thing." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the table, noting its position near the door. "And no one saw the tin during the meeting?" she asked. "Not a soul," Mrs. Price said firmly. "I'd have noticed it. We all would. It was only after, when Mrs. Baker was sweeping, that she saw it, right there, in the middle of the table, bold as brass." Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze falling on the faint outline of a circle in the dust, barely perceptible but unmistakable. To her trained eye, it was placed there deliberately. Then, she murmured, after the meeting began, perhaps during a moment of distraction, she turned to Mrs. Price, who left the room during the meeting, even briefly. Mrs. Price frowned, thinking. "Well, Miss Hartnell stepped out for a moment, said she needed air. She's been poorly lately, or so she claims. And Mrs. Langston left early, around 8, muttering something about a headache. Lucy was in and out of the kitchen, fetching more tea. But that's all I recall." Miss Marple nodded, filing away. The information, Miss Hartnell's brief absence, Mrs. Langston's early departure, and Lucy's movements to the kitchenhall were threads in the tapestry she was beginning to weave. And the tin itself, she said, was it familiar to anyone? Perhaps someone brought biscuits and forgot to mention it. Mrs. Price shook her head. No one claimed it. It was just an ordinary tin, the kind you see in every pantry. Floral pattern, a bit faded, Nothing special, except for, well, you. No, her voice dropped. The blood. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her mind turning to the tin's provenance. An ordinary object, yet its placement and the blood upon it suggested intent. Was it a warning, a mistake, or something more calculated? She decided her next step was to visit Rose Cottage, where Mrs. Vera Langston resided. The widow's late arrival and early departure at the meeting, coupled with the villagers' whispers about her past, made her a figure of interest. Rose Cottage lay at the end of a quiet lane, its garden a riot of late-blooming roses, their petals vivid against the grey sky. Miss Marple knocked, and after a moment Mrs. Langston opened the door. She was a tall woman, her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, her dress a shade of burgundy that spoke of wealth and taste. But her eyes, Miss Marple noted, held a flicker of wariness. Like a deer sensing a hunter, Miss Marple, Mrs. Langston said, her smile tight. What a surprise. Do come in. The sitting room was a study in contrasts. Elegant antiques jostled for space with modern touches, a sleek radio, a stack of fashion magazines. On a shelf near the window sat a biscuit tin, its floral pattern eerily similar to the one described by Mrs. Baker, though its lid gleamed, free of any stain. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it for a moment before she took the offered seat. "I won't keep you long," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been hearing about the incident at the church hall. A biscuit tin, of all things, with a most disturbing mark. Have you misplaced one recently, Mrs. Langston?" The widow's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair, a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. "A biscuit tin," she said, her voice light but strained. "I have several, as most people do, but I haven't misplaced any. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Oh, just village talk. You know how it is, something unusual happens, and everyone wonders. The tin was found after the WI meeting, and I understand you were there." Mrs. Langston's smile faltered. "Briefly, yes. I wasn't feeling well and left early, but I assure you, I know nothing about any tin." She rose, as if to signal the visit's end. "I'm afraid I have an appointment soon, Miss Marple. If there's nothing else." Miss Marple stood, undeterred by the dismissal. "Of course. Thank you for your time." As she stepped outside, she glanced at the garden, where Tom Blake was raking leaves. His broad shoulders were hunched, his movements deliberate but heavy, as if burdened by more than the weight of his task. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Clement's mention that Tom had worked for Mrs. Langston's late husband in London. His return to St. Mary Mead so soon after the widow's arrival was a coincidence worth noting. She paused by the gate, watching him. "Good morning, Tom," she called. He looked up, his weathered face guarded. "Morning, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice low. His hands, she noticed, bore faint scars, the kind that might come from years of gardening or from something less innocent. She thought of a case from years ago, a groundskeeper who'd used his knowledge of a household to exact revenge. Could Tom have a grievance? And could the tin be part of it? As she walked back to Dame Mead Cottage, the clouds finally broke, sending a light drizzle over the village. Miss Marple opened her umbrella, her mind sifting through the morning's discoveries. The tin's sudden appearance, the blood's grim implication, Mrs. Langston's unease, and Tom's scarred hands all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly together. She thought of Mrs. Price's certainty that the table had been clear, and of Miss Hartnell's brief absence. Had someone slipped into the hall unnoticed? Or had the tin been placed there before, overlooked in the bustle of the meeting? Back home, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she considered her next move. She would speak to Lucy Islesborough, whose sharp eyes might have caught something the others missed. And she would keep an eye on Mrs. Langston, whose polished exterior hid something fear, perhaps, or guilt. The biscuit tin, so ordinary yet so sinister, was a clue, and Miss Marple knew that clues, like seeds, needed only patience to reveal their secrets. Chapter 3. A Call on Rose Cottage. The drizzle that had begun the previous day had settled into a steady patter by the following morning, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a soft, grey veil. Miss Jane Marple, ever practical, adjusted her plans to the weather, slipping into her waterproof mackintosh and securing a scarf over her hat. Her destination was Rose Cottage, home of Mrs. Vera Langston, whose guarded demeanour and connection to the mysterious biscuit tin had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. In the quiet rhythms of village life, where every newcomer was scrutinised and every anomaly noted, Mrs. Langston stood out like a misplaced stitch in a familiar pattern. Miss Marple, with her unerring sense for such irregularities, intended to learn more. The lane to Rose Cottage wound past the village green, where the rain had turned the grass into a glistening carpet. Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunched on the gravel, her umbrella shielding her from the wet as she observed the world around her. The postman, Mr. Dobbs, cycled past, his cap pulled low, and a pair of sparrows quarrelled in a hawthorn bush. These were the ordinary details of St. Mary Mead, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath such ordinariness often lay the extraordinary. The biscuit tin, with its grim stain, was proof of that mundane object turned sinister by a single, deliberate mark. Rose Cottage came into view, its whitewashed walls softened by the mist, its roses drooping under the weight of the rain. The garden gate creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, her eyes catching the careful pruning of the shrubs, the work of Tom Blake, the gardener. He was nowhere to be seen this morning, though a wheelbarrow half filled with wet leaves stood by. The hedge, a sign of his recent presence. Miss Marple knocked on the door, her expression one of polite determination, though her mind was already cataloguing the possibilities that awaited within. Mrs. Langston opened the door after a moment's delay, her face composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. She wore a tailored grey dress, its severity offset by a single pearl brooch, and her hair was as immaculate as ever. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of caution. "What a surprise on such a dreary day. Do come in out of the rain." The sitting room was, as Miss Marple remembered it, a blend of elegance and clutter, with mahogany furniture polished to a high sheen and a scattering of modern trinkets that seemed out of place. The biscuit tin on the shelf caught her eye again, its floral pattern a near twin to the one found in the church hall, though its surface gleamed without a trace of blemish. Miss Marple took the offered seat by a small fire, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill outside. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple began, folding her hands in her lap. "I was passing by and thought to call. The village is still talking about that curious incident at the church hall. The biscuit tin, you know, it's caused quite a stir." Mrs. Langston's smile was thin, like a crack in fine china. "Yes, I've heard. Gossip travels fast here, doesn't it? But I'm afraid I know little about it. I was at the meeting, of course, but I left early. A headache, you see." She gestured to a teapot on the sideboard. "Would you like tea?" Miss Marple declined with a gentle shake of her head, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Langston's face. "Thank you, no. I was wondering if you might have seen anything unusual that evening. You arrived late, I understand, and left before the meeting ended. Perhaps you noticed someone near the hall, or something out of place." Mrs. Langston's fingers brushed the pearl brooch at her throat, a gesture Miss Marple noted as one of unconscious nerves. "Nothing at all," she said. "I was preoccupied, I'm afraid. The hall was busy when I arrived, and I slipped out quietly when I felt unwell. I barely noticed the table, let alone a tin." Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted to the shelf, where the pristine biscuit tin sat. Miss Marple followed her glance, her expression one of mild curiosity. "You have a similar tin, I see," she said, nodding toward the shelf. "They're quite common, aren't they? Though I suppose one doesn't expect to find them marked with, well, something so alarming." Mrs. Langston's laugh was brittle. "Oh, that old thing. It's just for biscuits. I have several, as most people do. As for the blood, it's probably some silly prank. Boys, perhaps, or someone with a grudge. Villagers are full of petty feuds, aren't they?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind sharp. "Though blood is a rather serious choice for a prank, it suggests something more personal." She paused, watching Mrs. Langston's reaction. The widow's face remained composed, but her hand tightened on the arm of her chair, the knuckles whitening for a moment before she relaxed. Miss Marple shifted the conversation to safer ground, inquiring about the roses in the garden, but her eyes continued to roam the room. A photograph on the mantel caught her attention. A stern-looking man in a suit, his eyes cold and his mouth set in a hard line. Mrs. Langston's late husband, she presumed, recalling the village gossip about his sudden death, fall down the stairs, ruled an accident, though whispers of foul play had lingered. She made a mental note to inquire further about Mr. Langston's demise. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple glanced out the window, where Tom Blake had appeared, raking leaves, with slow, deliberate strokes. His presence was a reminder of another thread in the puzzle. "Your gardener does fine work," she said casually. "Tom Blake, isn't it? I believe he worked for your husband in London." Mrs. Langston's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, Tom. He's been a great help since I moved here. Reliable, quiet. I was lucky to find him." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple detected a note of strain, as if the mention of Tom had touched a nerve. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist, and Miss Marple paused by the gate to exchange a few words with Tom. "Good morning, Tom," she called, her voice warm. The garden looked splendid, despite the weather. Tom looked up, his weathered face guarded but polite. "Morning, Miss Marple. Just keeping things tidy." His hands, she noticed again, bore those faint scars, like the traces of a story he hadn't told. She thought of a case from years past, a servant who'd carried a grudge against his employer, leaving subtle clues of his discontent. Was Tom such a man? And could the biscuit tin be his doing? "Thank you for the chat, Mrs. Langston," Miss Marple said, turning back to the cottage. "I'll let you get on with your day." She stepped into the lane, her umbrella bobbing. As she walked, her mind sifting through the morning's impressions, Mrs. Langston's unease, the tin on her shelf, Tom's scars, and the shadow of a husband's death all were fragments of a larger picture, one that Miss Marple was determined to piece together. Back at Mead cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she reflected. The biscuit tin was not just an object, but a message. Its blood, a deliberate mark meant to unsettle or accuse. Mrs. Langston's guarded manner suggested she knew more than she let on, and Tom's presence at Rose Cottage was no mere coincidence. Miss Marple thought of the Women's Institute meeting, of Miss Hartnell's brief absence and Lucy Islesborough's comings and goings. Someone had placed the tin in the hall, and someone had reason to do so. Her next step, she decided, would be to speak with Mrs. Clement, whose flustered kindness might conceal sharper observations than she realized. As the rain tapped against the window, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. The village might whisper, but she would listen, and in the listening, she would find the truth behind the blood on the biscuit tin. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Inset. The rain had settled into a persistent drizzle by the time Miss Jane Marple set out for the vicarage. Her umbrella, a steadfast shield against the damp, St. Mary Mead, with its sodden lanes and glistening rooftops, seemed to huddle under the grey sky, as if guarding its secrets more closely than usual. The vicarage, a rambling house with ivy creeping up its walls, stood just beyond the church, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth. Miss Marple's purpose was clear: a conversation with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose gentle nature often belied a keen awareness of the village's undercurrents. Miss Marple knew that in a place like St. Mary Mead, even the kindest souls could hold pieces of a puzzle, often without realizing their significance as she approached. The church clock struck 11, its chimes muffled by the mist. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, noting the neatly trimmed lawn and the chrysanthemums bowing under the weight of the rain. The vicarage garden was a testament to care, much like the village itself, yet Miss Marple's thoughts were on less orderly matters: the biscuit tin, its bloodied lid, and the faint threads connecting Mrs. Langston, Tom Blake, and the Women's Institute meeting. She knocked, and the door was opened by Mrs. Clement herself, her round face flushed from the warmth of the kitchen. Miss Marple. "Oh, do come in," Mrs. Clement said, her voice a mix of surprise and relief. "What a miserable day. I've just put the kettle on." She ushered Miss Marple into the sitting room, where a fire crackled and a tray of scones sat on a low table, their aroma mingling with the faint scent of beeswax polished dot. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her eyes taking in the room's comforting clutter: a stack of hymnals, a half-finished embroidery, and a photograph of the vicar, Leonard Clement, looking stern but kind. "Thank you, Mrs. Clement," she said, accepting a cup of tea. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I've been thinking about that odd business at the church hall, the biscuit tin, you know. It's caused quite a stir." Mrs. Clement's hands fluttered to her apron, a nervous habit Miss Marple noted with interest. "Oh, it's dreadful, isn't it? The whole village is talking about it. Leonard says it's a distraction from the harvest festival, but I can't help feeling uneasy." "Blood, Miss Marple? It's not the sort of thing one expects in St. Mary Mead." "Indeed not," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "You were at the Women's Institute meeting, I believe. Did you notice anything unusual that evening? Perhaps someone acting out of sorts, or an object that didn't belong?" Mrs. Clement frowned, her brow creasing as she stirred her tea. "Let me think. It was a busy evening, what with the festival planning. Mrs. Price was in charge, as always, and Lucy Islesborough was helping with the tea. Miss Hartnell was there, complaining about the hymnals, and Mrs. Langston arrived late, looking rather pale. I thought she seemed distracted, but then she often does." And Mrs. Weatherby was there, though she didn't hear much, poor dear. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the familiar names. And the tin itself, did you see it during the meeting? No, not at all, Mrs. Clement said firmly. The table was clear when we started, just the tea things and some papers. Have noticed a tin, especially one so unsettling. It was only after, when Mrs. Baker found it, that we heard about it. She was quite shaken, you know. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. Mrs. Price mentioned that Miss Hartnell stepped out briefly, and Mrs. Langston left early. Did you see either of them near the table before? They left. Mrs. Clement hesitated, her fingers twisting a napkin. Well, Miss Hartnell did go out for a moment. She said she felt faint, though she's always been one for dramatics. I saw her near the door, but not the table. As for Mrs. Langston, she was sitting at the back, and when she left, she slipped out so quickly I barely noticed. Lucy was the one moving about most, fetching more tea from the kitchen. But I can't imagine any of them leaving a tin like that. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to Lucy Islesborough's efficiency and Miss Hartnell's penchant for exaggeration. Mrs. Langston's early departure, however, lingered in her mind, as did her guarded manner at Rose Cottage. You mentioned Mrs. Langston seemed distracted, she said. Did she say anything unusual, or perhaps carry anything with her? Mrs. Clement tilted her head, thinking. Not that I recall. She had a small handbag, but nothing else. Oh. But there was one thing: she kept checking her watch, as if she was waiting for something. I thought it odd, given how short a time she stayed. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the possibility of a planned exit. And what of Tom Blake? She asked, her tone casual. I understand he worked for Mrs. Langston's late husband in London. It's curious, his returning to St. Mary Mead so soon after her arrival. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. Oh yes, I'd forgotten that. Tom was their gardener in London, wasn't he? Leonard mentioned it once. He came back quite suddenly, just a few weeks before Mrs. Langston took Rose Cottage. I thought it a coincidence. But now you mention it. She trailed off, her expression troubled. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did the vicar ever say why Tom returned, or what his time in London was like? Mrs. Clement shook her head. Not much, I'm afraid. Leonard only said Tom seemed different when he came back, quieter, more reserved. He'd worked for Mr. Langston for years, but there was some falling out, I think. Leonard didn't know the details. Tom's not one to talk much, is he? No, he isn't, Miss Marple murmured, recalling the gardener's scarred hands and guarded demeanour. She thought of a case from her youth: a butler who'd left his employer's service under a cloud, only to return years later with a score to settle. Could Tom's return be more than a coincidence? And could the biscuit tin, with its grim message, be his doing? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple glanced out the window, where the rain had slowed to a fine mist. Thank you, Mrs. Clement, she said. You've been most helpful. I mustn't keep you from your preparations. Mrs. Clement smiled, though her eyes were still anxious. Do be careful, Miss Marple. This business with the tinnet feels like trouble. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Trouble, perhaps, but trouble has a way of revealing itself, given time. She stepped into the damp air, her umbrella snapping open as she made her way back to Mead Cottage. The vicarage had offered no definitive answers, but Mrs. Clement's observations had added new threads to the tapestry. Mrs. Langston's distraction, Tom's sudden return, and the possibility of a hidden grievance. The biscuit tin, with its bloodied lid, was a clue that demanded context, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Back home, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she reflected. The village was a web of connections, each person linked to the next by habit, history, or hidden motives. Mrs. Langston's past, Tom's scars, and the tin's sudden appearance were not isolated facts, but parts of a larger pattern. Her next step, she decided, would be to speak with Lucy Islesborough, whose practical nature might have noticed something the others overlooked. As the rain tapped against the window, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve, ready to unravel the next strand of the mystery. Chapter 5. Lucy's observation. The rain had finally ceased, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a soft, silvery light as the clouds parted to reveal a tentative sun. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the village's rhythms, chose this moment to venture out, her destination the Blue Boar, the local tea shop where Lucy Islesborough often lingered after her morning errands. The air was fresh, carrying the earthy scent of wet grass and the faint sweetness of late-blooming honeysuckle. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her black umbrella now folded and tucked under her arm, a silent testament to her readiness for any turn in the weather. Or in the curious matter of the biscuit tin, the Blue Boar was a cozy establishment. Its windows steamed from the warmth within, its tables adorned with checkered cloths and vases of wilting marigolds. Inside, the hum of conversation mingled with the clink of teacups, and Miss Marple spotted Lucy at a corner table, her auburn hair catching the light as she pored over a notebook. Lucy Islesborough was a young woman of remarkable efficiency, known in St. Mary Mead for her ability to manage any household or task with a practicality that bordered on brilliance. Her presence at the Women's Institute meeting, where the blood-stained biscuit tin had appeared, made her a valuable witness in Miss Marple's quiet investigation. "Good morning, Lucy," Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile that was both warm and purposeful. "May I join you?" Lucy looked up, her green eyes bright with surprise. "Miss Marple, of course. Please sit. I was just jotting down some notes for the Harvest Festival." She closed her notebook, her manner open but alert, as if she sensed the visit was not entirely social. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You're always so busy, my dear," she said, her tone light. "I've been hearing about that odd business at the church. Hold a biscuit tin, you know. It's quite unsettled the village. As you were helping with the tea that evening, I thought you might have seen something the others missed." Lucy's expression sharpened, though her smile remained. "It's certainly stirred things up, hasn't it? I heard Mrs. Baker's still telling everyone about her scream when she found it, but I'm not sure I noticed anything special. It was a hectic evening, tea to pour, plates to clear, and Mrs. Price fussing about the festival schedule." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes keen behind her spectacles. "I'm sure it was. But you have such a sharp eye, Lucy. Tell me about the meeting. Who was where and when? Even the smallest detail might matter." Lucy leaned back, her fingers tapping the edge of her teacup as she thought. "Well, let's see. One arrived early to help Mrs. Price set up. The table was empty then, just the tea things we brought out later. The meeting started at 7, and everyone was there: Mrs. Clement, Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Weatherby, Mrs. Langston, and a few others. Mrs. Langston came in late, about 10 minutes after we started, and she sat at the back. She seemed off, somehow. Kept glancing at her watch, like she had somewhere else to be." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. And did she stay long? No, she left earlier, around 8, I think. Said she had a headache, but she was carrying a small bag, one of those fancy leather ones. I noticed because it didn't seem like something you'd bring to a WI meeting. Most of us just have our handbags or nothing at all. Lucy paused, her brow furrowing. Come to think of it, she was near the table when she left. She stopped there for a moment, adjusting her coat, but I didn't see her put anything down. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. That's very helpful, Lucy. And what about the others? Did anyone else go near the table or leave the room? Lucy sipped her tea, thinking. Miss Hartnell stepped out for a bit, said she felt faint, but she's always complaining about something. She was gone maybe 5 minutes, and I saw her near the door when she came back. Not the table. Mrs. Clement was mostly at the front, with Mrs. Price going over the festival plans. I was in and out of the kitchen, fetching more hot water and clearing plates. I suppose someone could have placed the tin when I wasn't looking, but it wasn't there when I cleared the table. At the end of the meeting. I'm sure of that. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving Lucy's observations into the tapestry of the case. Mrs. Langston's bag and her pause by the table were intriguing. Ours was Miss Hartnell's brief absence. And the tin itself, she said. Did you see it at all before Mrs. Baker found it? Lucy shook her head. Not a glimpse. I was tidying the kitchen after everyone left, and Mrs. Baker was sweeping the hall. That's when she screamed. I ran out and saw the tin on the table, with that awful red smear. It was just there, like it had appeared out of nowhere. Plain biscuits inside, nothing else. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the tin's sudden appearance, a deliberate act that suggested purpose, perhaps to unsettle, perhaps to accuse. You've been most helpful, Lucy, she said, rising. It's often the small things that matter most, don't you think? Lucy smiled, a touch of curiosity in her gaze. You're digging into this, aren't you, Miss Marple? I hope you find out what it's all about. It's giving me the creeps. Miss Marple's smile was serene but knowing. Oh, I'm just an old lady with too much time on her hands, my dear. But I do like to understand things. She thanked Lucy and stepped out into the village, where the sun was now breaking through, casting long shadows across the wet cobblestones as she walked back to Mead cottage. Miss Marple's mind sifted through Lucy's words. Distraction, her bag, and her pause by the table were pieces of a puzzle, as was Miss Hartnell's brief absence. The tin's placement after the meeting suggested someone had slipped into the hall unnoticed, or perhaps someone already present had acted in a moment of opportunity. She thought of Tom Blake, the gardener, whose scarred hands and connection to Mrs. Langston's past lingered in her mind. Could he have placed the tin, using the blood as a message? And if so, what was he trying to say? Back home, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting untouched as she reflected. The village was a web of glances and whispers, each person a thread in the mystery. Lucy's sharp eyes had added clarity, but the picture was still incomplete. Her next step, she decided, would be to speak with Miss Hartnell, whose penchant for drama might conceal a sharper observation or a secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The biscuit tin was a clue, and she would follow it, one quiet step at a time. Chapter 6. A nosy spinster, the sun had fully emerged by mid-morning. painting St. Mary Mead in a golden wash that made the damp cobblestones gleam like polished glass. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the village's subtle shifts, set out for Miss Hartnell's cottage, her steps light but purposeful. The air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of wood smoke and the promise of autumn's deeper chill. Her umbrella, though unnecessary today, was tucked under her armor habit, born of years navigating unpredictable weather and equally unpredictable human nature. Miss Hartnell, with her sharp tongue and sharper curiosity, was a known quantity. In St. Mary Mead, a woman whose piety often masked a relentless need to know everyone's business. Miss Marple suspected that her brief absence during the Women's Institute meeting, coupled with her proximity to the church hall, might hold a clue to the mystery of the blood-stained biscuit tin. Miss Hartnell's cottage, a squat, ivy-clad dwelling on the edge of the village, was a monument to propriety. Lace curtains framed the windows, and a brass knocker gleamed with obsessive care. The garden, though small, was ruthlessly tidy, its roses pruned to within an inch of their lives. Miss Marple knocked, and the door opened almost at once, revealing Miss Hartnell in a severe black dress, her grey hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes, small and bright like a bird's, fixed on Miss Marple with a mix of suspicion and eagerness. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the indignation she reserved for most occasions. "What brings you here? Not that dreadful. Tin business, I hope. The village is positively awash with nonsense about it." She stepped aside, gesturing for Miss Marple to enter. The sitting room was as Miss Marple expected, a shrine to order, with doilies on every surface, a shelf of well-worn prayer books, and a single photograph of Miss Hartnell's late brother, a dear clergyman who'd left her the cottage. A small fire burned in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Miss Marple took a seat, noting a narrow drawer in a side table, its handle slightly askew, as if recently opened. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Hartnell," she said, her tone gentle but deliberate. "I've been hearing so much about the church hall incident. It's quite unsettled everyone, hasn't it? As you were at the meeting, I thought you might have noticed something unusual." Miss Hartnell's lips pursed, her hands folding tightly. In her lap, unusual. The whole affair is outrageous. Blood on a biscuit tin, of all things. It's a sign, Miss Marple, a sign of moral decay. I told Mrs. Price we need stricter oversight at these meetings. Anyone could wander in. Her voice rose, but Miss Marple's calm gaze seemed to temper her fervour. "Quite so," Miss Marple said. "I understand you stepped out briefly during the meeting. Did you see anything or anyone near the hall when you did?" Miss Hartnell's eyes narrowed, and she shifted in her chair. "Stepped out? Oh yes, I felt a touch faint. The room was stuffy, and all that talk about the harvest festival was giving me a headache. I just needed a breath of air, that's all. I went to the porch and came right back. I didn't see anything, certainly not a tin." Her tone was defensive, and her fingers twitched toward the drawer, a movement Miss Marple noted with interest. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "It must have been a trying evening. Did you happen to notice Mrs. Langston? I hear she left early." Miss Hartnell sniffed, her disapproval palpable. That woman, always flouncing in late, with her fancy hats and her airs. "Yes, she left early, muttering about a headache. I saw her by the door as I came back in, fussing with her bag. Probably couldn't wait to get away from us common folk." Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of gossip, but Miss Marple sensed a hint of unease beneath her bluster. "And the table where the tin was found," Miss Marple continued, Did you pass by it when you returned? Perhaps you saw something out of place. Miss Hartnell's hand moved to the drawer again, then stopped. The table? No, I didn't go near it. I sat at the front with Mrs. Clement. The tea things were there, but nothing else. I'd have noticed a tin, especially one with, well, you know. Her voice faltered, and she glanced at the drawer once more, a gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice as they spoke. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the drawer, catching a glint of metal through its slightly open edge. A biscuit tin, a key. She couldn't be sure, but the sight stirred a memory of a case from years ago, a spinster who'd hidden a stolen brooch in a drawer, her guilt betrayed by her nervous glances. "You keep a tidy home, Miss Hartnell," she said, changing tack. "I imagine you notice everything in its place." Miss Hartnell preened slightly. "I do my best. Order is next to godliness, after all." But her eyes darted to the drawer again, and she rose abruptly. "Would you like tea, Miss Marple? I've some biscuits somewhere." She moved toward the kitchen, but Miss Marple declined, rising to her feet. "No, thank you. I mustn't keep you," she said, her smile serene. "You've been most helpful." She stepped toward the door, pausing to glance at the drawer one last time. The glint was gone, the drawer now firmly shut, as if Miss Hartnell's movement had been a distraction. Outside, the sun was higher, casting sharp shadows across the village. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sifting through the conversation. Miss Hartnell's defensiveness, her nervous glances at the drawer, and her quick dismissal of Mrs. Langston suggested more than mere gossip. Had she seen something or done something during her brief absence from the meeting? And what was in that drawer? Miss Marple thought of Lucy's observation of Mrs. Langston's pause by the table, and Mrs. Clement's mention of Tom Blake's connection to the Langston household. The threads were multiplying, but the pattern remained elusive. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting untouched as she reflected. The biscuit tin was a deliberate act, its blood a message meant to provoke or reveal. Miss Hartnell's unease suggested she knew more than she admitted, and the drawer hinted at a secret. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tom Blake, whose scarred hands and quiet return to St. Mary Mead were pieces of the same puzzle. Her next step, she decided, would be to speak with P.C. Hurst, who might have news of the blood's analysis. As the village settled into its afternoon quiet, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with resolve, ready to unravel the next strand of the mystery. Chapter 7. The blood's origin. The afternoon sun cast long, slanting rays over St. Mary Mead, gilding the wet rooftops and turning the puddles in the lanes into fleeting mirrors. Miss Jane Marple, undaunted by the lingering dampness, made her way toward the village police station, a small brick building tucked behind the post office. Her steps were unhurried, her black umbrella now a walking stick, tapping lightly against the cobblestones. The mystery of the blood-stained biscuit tin had deepened with each conversation, and Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of observations, Mrs. Langston's guarded glances, Tom Blake's scarred hands, Miss Hartnell's nervous drawl, and Lucy Islesborough's sharp-eyed account. Yet the blood itself, that stark crimson smear, remained the heart of the puzzle. And Miss Marple hoped P.C. Hurst might provide a crucial piece, its origin. The police station was a modest affair, its front room cluttered with filing cabinets and a single desk where P.C. Hurst sat, scribbling in a ledger. He was a young man, earnest, but often out of his depth in matters beyond stolen bicycles or noisy dogs. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his face brightening with a mix of respect and unease. "Miss Marple, good afternoon. I suppose you're..." Hear about that tin business. It's got the whole village in a tizzy." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair opposite his desk. "Good afternoon, Constable. Yes, I've been hearing quite a bit about it. A most unsettling discovery. Have you had any news from the county hospital about the blood?" PC Hurst leaned back, his chair creaking. "As a matter of fact, I just got a call from Dr. Haydock this morning. The analysis came through, and it's human blood, no question. Fresh, too less than a day old when Mrs. Baker found it. But here's the odd part. There's no match in our records, and no one's been reported missing or injured in the area. It's like the blood came from nowhere." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind turning over this new information. "Fresh blood, you say? That's very curious. No reports of accidents or injuries at all, not even a minor cut." "Not a thing," PC Hurst said, shaking his head. "I've asked around doctors, surgery, the chemist, even the butcher, thinking it might be animal blood misidentified. But Dr. Haydock's certain it's human. He's sending the sample to London for further tests, but that'll take time." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the implications. Fresh human blood suggested a recent act of violence, perhaps, or a deliberate gesture. Yet the absence of a victim was puzzling, unless the blood was meant as a message rather than evidence of a crime. She recalled a case from years ago, where a bloodied handkerchief had been left in a vicar's study, not as proof of murder, but as a warning to a wayward parishioner. Could the tin be such a warning? And if so, to whom? "Did you examine the tin itself?" she asked. "Any fingerprints or other marks?" PC Hurst sighed. "We tried, but the lid was smudged too many hands. Probably from Mrs. Baker and others who picked it up before we got there. The biscuits inside were ordinary digestives, nothing unusual. The tin's just one of those common ones you see. Everywhere, floral pattern, a bit worn. No way to trace where it came from." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. "And where is the tin now?" "Locked up in evidence," he said, gesturing to a cabinet behind him. "Not that it's telling us much. I've been over to the church hall too, but there's nothing there, no blood, no footprints. Just that dusty ring on the table where the tin was." Miss Marple nodded, recalling the faint circle she'd noticed herself. "Thank you, Constable. You've been most helpful. If anything else comes up, do let me know." She rose, her expression serene but her mind racing, as she stepped back. Into the village, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the rooftops. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving together the threads of the case. The blood's freshness ruled out an old incident, and the lack of a victim suggested no immediate crime, at least, not one reported. She thought of Mrs. Langston's nervous demeanor at Rose Cottage, the pristine tin on her shelf, and Tom Blake's scarred hands. Could the blood be his, shed in a moment of anger or calculation? And what of Miss Hartnell's drawer, with its mysterious glint? The spinster's unease hinted at knowledge, perhaps unwillingly held back at Mead Cottage. Miss Marple was surprised to find her nephew, Raymond West, waiting in the sitting room. He was sprawled in an armchair, his writer's notebook open but ignored, his face alight with curiosity. "Aunt Jane, I heard about this biscuit tin nonsense. Sounds like something out of one of my novels. Human blood, really. Probably a prank. Gone wrong, don't you think?" Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting untouched. "A prank," I moaned. "Perhaps, but human blood is a serious matter, not the sort of thing one uses lightly." No, I think there's intent behind it, a message, or a warning. Raymond raised an eyebrow, his skepticism tempered by affection. You're sleuthing again, aren't you? Well, what's your theory? Some village feud gone gothic. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not quite, my dear. But people are rarely as simple as they seem, even in a place like St. Mary Mead. I shall need to think a bit more, and perhaps speak to one or two others. Raymond grinned. You're incorrigible. Just don't go getting yourself into trouble. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Trouble, Raymond, has a way of finding me, but I find it best to meet it with a clear head. As her nephew left, she turned her gaze to the fire, her mind sifting through the morning's revelations. The blood's origin was a key, but it was locked in a web of village secrets. Mrs. Langston's past, Tom's return, Miss Hartnell's drawer, and Lucy's sharp eyes. Her next step, she decided, would be to seek out Tom Blake, whose quiet presence and scarred hands suggested a story yet untold. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's resolve hardened, ready to trace the blood to its source, one careful step at a time. Chapter 8. The gardener's secret. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was sharp with the tang of autumn, the sun climbing slowly to burn away the mist that clung to the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her familiar tweed coat and clutching her ever-present umbrella, set out toward the churchyard, where she knew Tom Blake, the gardener, would be tending the grounds. The village was stirring into its daily rhythm. Mr. Dobbs, the postman, cycled past with a nod, and the distant clatter of milk bottles echoed from the dairy cart. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were far from these ordinary sounds, focused instead on the blood-stained biscuit tin and the web of secrets it had begun to unravel. Tom Blake, with his scarred hands and quiet return from London, was a thread she could no longer ignore. The churchyard was a quiet haven, its ancient use casting long shadows over weathered gravestones. Tom was there, as expected, kneeling by a flower bed, his trowel moving with the steady precision of long practice. His broad shoulders were hunched, his face half hidden by a worn cap. But Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, as if he sensed the weight of unseen eyes. She approached slowly, her steps soft on the damp grass, her expression one of gentle inquiry. "Good morning, Tom," she called, her voice warm but carrying the faintest edge of purpose. "You've done wonders with the churchyard. The chrysanthemums are quite splendid this year." Tom looked up, his weathered face guarded but polite. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, brushing soil from his hands. The scars she'd noticed before faint, jagged lines across his knuckles, were more visible in the morning light, hinting at a history of labor or conflict. "Just keeping things tidy. Vicar likes it neat for the harvest festival." Miss Marple nodded, settling onto a nearby bench, her umbrella resting across her knees. "It's a peaceful spot," she said, her eyes scanning the churchyard before settling on him. "You've been a great help to the village since you came back from London. I understand you worked for Mrs. Langston's late husband there. It must have been quite a change, coming back to St. Mary Mead." Tom's hands paused, the trowel hovering above the soil. It was," he said, his voice low and careful. "London's no place for me anymore. Too much noise, too many people. I wanted quiet." He resumed digging, but his movements were stiffer, as if her words had stirred something he preferred to keep buried. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was as sharp as ever. "I imagine it wasn't easy, working for Mr. Langston," she said, her tone conversational but probing. Mrs. Clement mentioned there was some trouble before you left. It's curious, you're returning just as Mrs. Langston took up residence at Rose Cottage. Tom's jaw tightened, and he set the trowel down, wiping his hands on his trousers. Trouble, he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, dark and wary. Aye, you could say that. Mr. Langston wasn't a kind man, sharp with his words, sharper with his fists. Fired me when I caught him cheating at cards with his business partners. Said I was stealing, but it was a lie to cover his own shame. He spat into the flower bed, a rare flash of anger breaking his reserve. When he died, I figured it was time to come home. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind weaving this new thread into the tapestry of the case. His death must have been a shock, she said. A fall down the stairs, I believe. Such tragedies often leave questions unanswered. Tom's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back on his heels. Questions, maybe. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd been gone a month by then. Mrs. Langston sent me a letter, said she was moving here, offered me work. I took it, needed the money, and I know her ways. His voice was flat, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something resentment, perhaps, or guilt. She thought of a case from her youth, a coachman dismissed for witnessing his employer's indiscretions, who later returned to expose a hidden crime. Could Tom's bitterness run deeper than he let on? And could the biscuit tin, with its grim smear of blood, be his way of pointing to a truth the village had yet to see? You've been most kind to help Mrs. Langston, she said, her tone gentle. Though I wonder about that tin in the church hall. A strange thing, blood on a biscuit tin. It feels like a message, don't you think? Tom's hands froze, and for a moment he seemed to hold his breath. A message, he said, his voice rough. Sounds like village nonsense to me. Probably. Kids mucking about. But his eyes darted toward the church, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, as if her words had struck closer than he cared to admit. Perhaps, she said, rising from the bench. But blood is a serious matter, Tom. It speaks of intent, even if we don't yet understand it. She paused, her gaze lingering on his scarred hands. You take care with your gardening. Those cuts look painful. Tom glanced at his hands, his expression unreadable. Just scratches from the roses, he muttered. They heal. He turned back to his work, signaling the conversation's end. But Miss Marple's mind was already racing, as she walked back to Dame Mead Cottage. The village was settling into its midday quiet. The only sounds, the distant bleat of sheep and the soft cooing of pigeons. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Tom's story, his dismissal, his bitterness, his return. The scars on his hands could indeed be from gardening, but they could also be from something more deliberate, like a calculated act to draw attention. She recalled Lucy's mention of Mrs. Langston's pause by the table, Miss Hartnell's nervous draw, and P.C. Hurst's confirmation of fresh human blood. Could Tom have shed that blood, perhaps from a minor cut, to point a finger at Mrs. Langston? And if so, what did he know about her husband's death? Back home, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting untouched as she reflected. The biscuit tin was no random prank, but a deliberate clue, its blood a silent accusation. Tom's anger at his former employer suggested a motive, and his presence at Rose Cottage tied him to Mrs. Langston's past. Yet Miss Hartnell's unease and Lucy's observations hinted at other hands at play. Her next step, she decided, would be to attend the next Women's Institute meeting, where the villagers' secrets might reveal themselves in a glance or a gesture. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination, ready to unravel the gardener's secret and the truth behind the blood. Chapter 9. The tin's twin. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and casting long shadows across the lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat buttoned against the evening's creeping chill, made her way to the church hall for the next Women's Institute meeting. Her umbrella, though the sky was clear, was a familiar companion, its tip tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The mystery of the blood-stained biscuit tin had grown more intricate with each conversation. Tom Blake's bitter revelations, Mr. Hartnell's nervous glances, Lucy Islesborough's keen observations, and the stark fact of fresh human blood. Tonight, Miss Marple hoped the gathering might offer a new glimpse into the villagers' secrets, for in the chatter and glances of such meetings, truth often slipped through like light through a cracked shutter. The church hall was aglow with lamplight, its windows casting a warm invitation against the gathering dusk. Inside, the air hummed with the usual bustle. Mrs. Price arranging agendas, Mrs. Clement fussing over a tray of sandwiches, and a dozen other women exchanging greetings and gossip. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, her presence as unassuming as ever, though her eyes missed nothing. She noted the long table, now cleared of any trace of the sinister tin, and the familiar faces, Mrs. Clement's flustered kindness, Miss Hartnell's sharpered scrutiny, and Lucy's efficient grace as she poured tea. But it was Mrs. Vera Langston who drew her attention, standing near the back, her burgundy hat a splash of elegance amid the villagers' more modest attire. Miss Marple took a seat near the window, her knitting bag at her side, though she had no intention of knitting tonight. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Langston, who had brought a tin of biscuits, its floral pattern strikingly similar to the one found with the blood. The lid gleamed under the hall's lights, pristine and unmarred, yet its resemblance to the other tin was uncanny. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind weaving this new thread into the tapestry of the case. As the meeting began, Mrs. Price called for order, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Ladies, we have much to discuss: the harvest festival, the jumble sale, and, of course, we must address the unfortunate incident last week." A murmur rippled through the room, and Miss Marple noted Mrs. Langston's slight stiffening, her fingers tightening around the tin she'd placed on a side table. Miss Marple leaned toward Lucy, who was seated nearby, and whispered, "That tin Mrs. Langston brought, it's very like the one from before, isn't it?" Lucy's green eyes flicked to the tin, then back to Miss Marple. "It is," she murmured. "I noticed it when she arrived." She was wiping it down outside, almost frantically, before she came in. "Odd, don't you think? As if she was afraid of something on it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Very odd indeed," she said softly. She recalled her visit to Rose Cottage, where a similar tin had sat on Mrs. Langston's shelf, its surface spotless. Was this the same tin, or another of its kind? And why the frantic cleaning? She thought of a case from years ago, where a housekeeper had scrubbed a silver tray to erase traces of poison. Her guilt betrayed by her obsessive care. Could Mrs. Langston be hiding something similar? As the meeting droned on discussions of bunting colours and choir schedules, Miss Marple's attention remained on Mrs. Langston. The widow's face was composed, but her eyes darted occasionally to the tin, as if it held more significance than mere biscuits. When the meeting paused for tea, Miss Marple approached her, her smile as gentle as ever. "Mrs. Langston, your biscuits look delightful," she said, nodding toward the tin. That's a charming tin. I believe I saw one like it at Rose Cottage. You must be fond of the design." Mrs. Langston's smile was tight, her hand brushing the tin's lid. "Oh, it's just an old thing," she said, her voice light but strained. "I have several, you know. They're so common." She opened the tin, revealing neat rows of shortbread, and offered one to Miss Marple, who declined with a polite wave. "Just a coincidence." Then Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively mild, "Though it's curious, isn't it, how similar it is to the one found last week. The village is still talking about that blood." She watched Mrs. Langston closely, noting the faint flush that crept up her neck. "A silly prank." "No doubt," Mrs. Langston said, her laugh brittle. "I really must help with the tea." She moved away, but Miss Marple's eyes followed her, catching the way her fingers lingered on the tin before she set it down. As the meeting resumed, Miss Marple slipped out quietly, her mind buzzing. The tin's twin was no mere coincidence. It was a clue, deliberate or accidental, to something Mrs. Langston wished to conceal. She decided to take a closer look at the church hall's storage cupboard, where forgotten items often lingered. With Mrs. Price's permission, she opened the cupboard door, its hinges creaking in protest. Inside, among Mafalda, the old maid who cleaned Miss Marple's cottage, was sweeping the hall, and she waved her away, promising to be quick. Tucked behind a stack of dusty hymnals was another biscuit tin, its floral pattern faded but unmistakable. The lid was slightly dented, and a faint whiff of cleaning fluid lingered, as if someone had scrubbed it recently. No blood, no biscuits, just an empty shell. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Had this tin been swapped for the bloodied one, or was it another piece of the puzzle? She closed the cupboard, her mind racing with possibilities. Back at Dame Mead Cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched. The tin in the cupboard, the twin on Mrs. Langston's table, and the blood-stained original formed a triangle of intent. Mrs. Langston's frantic wiping, Tom Blake's scars, and Miss Hartnell's drawer all pointed to a hidden truth. Miss Marple recalled a case where a misplaced locket had revealed a theft. Perhaps this tin was a similar key. Her next step, she decided, would be to confront the threads directly, perhaps by inviting the key players to her cottage. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, ready to unravel the secret of the tin's twin. Chapter 10. A confrontation. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a deep indigo, pricked with the first stars of autumn, as Miss Jane Marple prepared her modest drawing room at Dame Mead Cottage for an unusual gathering. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the lace-covered table, where a tea tray sat with cups arranged in precise order. Miss Marple, in her familiar black dress and shawl, moved with quiet purpose, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles that lay untouched in her basket. The mystery of the blood-stained biscuit tin had woven a web of suspicion. Mrs. Langston's guarded demeanor, Tom Blake's scarred hands and bitter past, Miss Hartnell's nervous drawer, and the discovery of the tin's twin in the church hall cupboard. Tonight, Miss Marple intended to draw these threads together, trusting that a gentle confrontation might loosen the truth. From the village's tightly knit secrets, she had sent polite notes to Mrs. Vera Langston, Tom Blake, and Miss Hartnell, inviting them for tea under the pretext of discussing the harvest festival. P.C. Hurst was also invited, his presence requested discreetly to lend an air of authority without alarming her guests. The constable arrived first, his uniform slightly, rumpled, his face a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple, I hope you know what you're doing, he said, settling into an armchair. This tin business is beyond me, but if you've got a hunch, I'm here. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Thank you. Constable, I find that a quiet chat often reveals more than one expects. Just listen, and we'll see what comes to light. Miss Hartnell arrived next, her severe black dress rustling as she entered, her eyes darting about as if expecting an ambush. Miss Marple, I must say, this is most irregular, she huffed, taking a seat. Tea at this hour, and with such a mixed group. Her fingers fidgeted, and Miss Marple noted the same nervous energy she'd seen at the cottage. As if the spinster feared her secrets were too close to the surface, Mrs. Langston followed, her burgundy hat a bold contrast to her pale face. She carried herself with practiced poise, but her smile was strained, and her eyes flicked to the door as if calculating an escape. How kind of you to invite me, Miss Marple, she said, her voice smooth but brittle. Though I'm not sure what I can contribute to festival plans. Tom Blake was the last to arrive, his workman's boots leaving faint traces of soil on the rug. He stood awkwardly by the door, his scarred hands tucked into his pockets, his cap clutched under his arm. Evening, Miss Marple, he muttered, his gaze fixed on the floor. Didn't expect to be here. Miss Marple ushered them to their seats, pouring tea with a calm that belied the tension in the room. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice gentle but firm. I've been thinking about the curious incident at the church holder biscuit tin with its troubling stain. It's caused such a stir, and I thought we might put our heads together to make sense of it. After all, in a village like St. Mary, Mead, we're all connected, aren't we? Miss Hartnell sniffed, her hands folding tightly in her lap. It's a disgrace, that's what it is. A prank, no doubt, though I can't imagine who'd do such a thing. Mrs. Langston's lips twitched into a faint smile. Village nonsense, surely. I've said before, it's probably children playing a trick. Tom remained silent, his eyes fixed on his tea, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw, the way his scarred hands gripped the cup. She set her own cup down, her gaze moving from one guest to another. Perhaps, she said, but human blood is a serious matter, as Constable Hurst can confirm. Fresh blood, less than a day old, with no victim reported. It suggests a message or a warning. And then there's the tin itself, so like the one I saw at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Langston, and another I found in the church hall cupboard, scrubbed clean but dented, as if someone wished to hide its past. Mrs. Langston's face paled, her fingers tightening on her saucer. I've told you, Miss Marple, I have several tins. They're common enough. You can't possibly think. Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression serene but unyielding. I don't think, Mrs. Langston, I observe. And I've observed that you were distracted at the WI meeting, pausing by the table before you left early. Lucy Islesborough saw you wiping a similar tin before the last meeting, as if you feared something on it. And Tom, you worked for Mrs. Langston's late husband, didn't you? A man who dismissed you unjustly, by your account. You returned to St. Mary Mead just as Mrs. Langston arrived, and your hands bear scars that might suggest more than gardening mishaps. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes dark with anger. What are you getting at, Miss Marple? I've done nothing wrong. Those scars are from work, nothing more. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice held steady. I believe you know more than you've said, Tom. The tin was a message, wasn't it? A warning to Mrs. Langston, perhaps, about her husband's death. You told me he was a cruel man, and you saw something in London, something you've kept silent about until now. Mrs. Langston's cup clattered against its saucer, and she stood, her face ashen. This is absurd. You're accusing me of what? I had nothing to do with that tin. Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes. Not just indignation. Miss Hartnell, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice shrill. I saw Tom. I saw him near the hall that night. After I stepped out for air, he was by the side door, holding something, maybe that tin. I thought it was rubbish and moved it to the table when I came back. I didn't know it was that. Her hands fluttered to her chest, her eyes wide with realization. Tom's face darkened, and he rose, his fists clenched. I didn't put no blood on it, he growled, but I know what I saw in London. Mrs. Langston pushed her husband down those stairs. I was in the garden, saw it through the window. She paid me to keep quiet, gave me money to leave. But I couldn't stay silent forever. I put the tin there, yes, with my own blood from a cut thumb. I wanted her to know I hadn't forgotten. Mrs. Langston gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You're lying. It was an accident. He fell, but her voice wavered, and her eyes darted to P.C. Hurst, who had risen. His notebook in hand, Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension, calm but incisive. The tin was your way of speaking, Tom, wasn't it? A crude message, but effective. And Miss Hartnell, your nosiness moved it to the table where it was found. Mrs. Langston, you've carried a heavy secret, haven't you? One that followed. You too, St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Langston sank back into her chair, her composure crumbling. He was a brute, she whispered, tears welling. He deserved it. I didn't mean to kill him, but he was cruel, and I couldn't bear it any more. Her voice broke, and P.C. Hurst stepped forward, his expression grim. We'll need to take a statement, Mrs. Langston, he said, and Tom, you'll need to come too, for withholding evidence. As the room fell silent, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, her hands steady. The truth had surfaced, as it always did, in the quiet spaces between words and glances. The biscuit tin, with its bloodied lid, had spoken, and St. Mary Mead would soon return to its gentle rhythm. The next secret stirred. Chapter 11. The Confession. The air in Miss Jane Marple's drawing room at Danemead Cottage hung heavy with the weight of revelation. The fire's crackle, the only sound breaking the stunned silence that followed Tom Blake's accusation and Mrs. Vera Langston's faltering denial. The soft glow of lamplight cast flickering shadows on the lace-covered table, where the tea tray sat untouched, the cups cooling as the truth began to unravel. Miss Marple, seated calmly with her hands folded in her lap, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity, her eyes moving from Mrs. Langston's ashen face to Tom's clenched fists and Miss Hartnell's wide-eyed shock. P.C. Hurst stood ready, his notebook open, his presence a steady anchor in the room's charged atmosphere. The blood-stained biscuit tin, though absent, loomed large in their midst, its grim message now pointing to a crime far older than the village had suspected. Mrs. Langston's shoulders slumped, her elegant composure shattered as she buried her face in her hands. It wasn't meant to happen, she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. You don't understand, he was a monster. Her words, barely audible, carried the weight of years. And Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of gentle encouragement, though her mind was as sharp as ever, piecing together the final threads of the mystery. Perhaps, Mrs. Langston, Miss Marple said softly, you might tell us what happened. The truth has a way of easing the burden, don't you think? Mrs. Langston raised her head, her eyes glistening with tears, her burgundy hat now slightly askew. She glanced at Tom, then at P.C. Hurst, and finally at Miss Marple, whose calm gaze seemed to steady her. "It was in London," she began, her voice halting. "My husband, Richard, he wasn't the man people thought. To the world, he was charming, successful, but at home, he was cruel. He'd mock me, belittle me, and when he drank, he'd—" She paused, her fingers twisting the pearl brooch at her throat. "He'd hurt me, not always with his hands, but with words, with control. I lived in fear of him." Miss Hartnell gasped, her hand flying to her chest. But Miss Marple remained still, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Langston's face. She thought of a case from her youth, a woman trapped in a marriage to a tyrant, whose quiet desperation had led to a desperate act. "Go on," she said gently. Mrs. Langston took a shaky breath. "That night, a year ago, we argued. He'd been drinking, as usual, and he was furious something about a deal gone wrong. He came at me, shouting, and I pushed him. We were at the top of the stairs. I didn't mean to kill him, I swear. I just wanted him to stop." Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth, as if to hold back the flood of guilt. "He fell, and when I ran down, he was gone. I panicked. I told the police it was an accident, and they believed me. There were no witnesses, or so I thought." Tom Blake's face darkened, his scarred hands clenching tighter. "I saw it," he growled. "I was in the garden, trimming the hedges late. Looked up and saw you push him through the window. You knew I saw, didn't you? You gave me money, told me to leave London, to keep my mouth shut. I took it because I had no job, no prospects. But it ate at me, Mrs. Langston. When you came to St. Mary Mead, I followed. I couldn't let it rest." Mrs. Langston's eyes widened, her voice rising in desperation. "I paid you to protect us both. You'd have been ruined if you'd spoken. Then, why bring it up now? That tin was that you're doing, to torment me." Tom's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his gaze steady. I cut my thumb on a pruning knife, smeared the blood on that tin, and left it in the hall. I wanted you to know I hadn't forgotten. I wanted you to feel what I felt, carrying that secret." Miss Hartnell, who had been silent, let out a strangled cry. "You mean to say you put that dreadful thing there, Tom Blake?" And I moved it to the table, thinking it was rubbish. Oh, the horror of it. Her hands fluttered, her face a picture of righteous indignation, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if her own secrets had been overshadowed. P.C. Hurst, scribbling furiously in his notebook, looked up. "This is serious, Mrs. Langston. You're admitting to causing your husband's death. And Tom, you've withheld evidence of a crime. I'll need you both to come to the station for full statements." Mrs. Langston's tears spilled over, but she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill him, but I couldn't live like that anymore. I thought moving here would be a fresh start, but—" She trailed off, her gaze distant, as if seeing the stairs in that London house once more. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind remained clear. "You carried a heavy burden, Mrs. Langston," she said, "and Tom, your silence was a burden too, wasn't it? The tin was your way of speaking, but truth has a way of coming out, even in a quiet village like this." P.C. Hurst stepped forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "Let's go, Mrs. Langston. Tom, you too. We'll sort this out properly." He guided them to the door, Mrs. Langston moving as if in a trance, Tom's face a mask of grim resolve. Miss Hartnell, still clutching her chest, muttered about the decline of village morals. But Miss Marple's calm presence silenced her. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple sat back, her hands resting in her lap. The room felt quieter now, the tension dissipating like mist in the morning sun. The biscuit tin, with its bloodied lid, had been a crude but effective catalyst, drawing out a confession that had lain buried for a year. Miss Marple thought of the villagers' whispers, of Lucy's sharp eyes, and of the tin's twin in the church hall cupboard, scrubbed clean but heavy with intent. The truth had emerged, not through grand gestures, but through the small details she had always trusted: a glance, a pause, a scarred hand. She rose to clear the tea tray, her movements deliberate, her mind already turning to the villagers' next chapter. St. Mary Mead would talk of this for weeks, but Miss Marple knew the ripples would fade, as they always did, until the next secret stirred. For now, the fire burned low, and the truth, like the tea, had gone cold but clear. Chapter 12. The quiet returns. Autumn deepened in St. Mary Mead. The village settled into a hush, as if exhaling after the storm of whispers stirred by the blood-stained biscuit tin. The October days grew shorter, the air sharper, and the leaves fell in earnest, carpeting the lanes in shades of amber and crimson. Miss Jane Marple sat by her drawing-room fire at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, crafting a scarf in soft grey wool for her nephew Raymond West. The events of the past days, Mrs. Langston's tearful confession, Tom Blake's grim revelation, and Miss Hartnell's unwitting role in the drama had unravelled the mystery, leaving the village to mend its torn fabric in its own quiet way. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room's familiar comforts. The lace curtains, the polished mahogany table, the bowl of potpourri that scented the air with lavender. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on her knitting, but on the delicate threads of human nature she had traced to their source. The biscuit tin, with its crude smear of blood, had been no mere prank, but a cry from the past, a signal of guilt and retribution that had drawn the villagers' secrets into the light. Mrs. Langston was now in custody, awaiting trial for her husband's death, and Tom Blake faced questioning for his role in concealing the truth. Miss Hartnell, though shaken, had returned to her cottage, her indignation tempered by the realization that her nosiness had played a part in the revelation. A knock at the door broke Miss Marple's reverie, and Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy bustled in, her hat slightly askew, her cheeks flushed with the chill of the evening. "Jane," she exclaimed, settling into an armchair with a huff. "I've just come from the post office, and it's all anyone can talk about. Mrs. Langston, a murderer, and Tom Blake, of all people, stirring up trouble with that dreadful tin. You must tell me everything. How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled, setting her knitting aside to pour tea from a waiting pot. "Not know, Elspeth, but observe," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It was the small things, as always. Mrs. Langston's unease, Tom's scars, Miss Hartnell's nervous glances at her drawer, and Lucy's sharp eyes. The tin was a message, you see, and messages have senders and recipients. Tom sent it, and Mrs. Langston received it, though neither expected the village to read it so clearly." Mrs. McGillicuddy's eyes widened, her teacup pausing halfway to her lips. "But the blood, Jane, Tom's own blood, from a cut thumb, is positively gothic, and to think Miss Hartnell moved the tin, thinking it was rubbish. Oh, the scandal." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Scandal, perhaps, but also truth. Tom's anger at his former employer drove him to act, and Mrs. Langston's guilt made her fear the tin's meaning. Miss Hartnell, bless her, was merely the catalyst, her curiosity placing the tin where it would be found. It's often the way Elspeth people's own natures betray them, even in a quiet place like St. Mary Mead. Mrs. McGillicuddy shook her head, marvelling. You're remarkable, Jane, to see all that in a biscuit tin. What will happen to them now? Mrs. Langston and Tom, I mean. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze distant. Mrs. Langston will face the law, though I suspect the court may find her act one of desperation rather than malice. As for Tom, his silence was a crime, but his confession may lighten his punishment. The village will talk for a while, but it will settle, as it always does. Mrs. McGillicuddy leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And that other tin, the one in the church hall cupboard, was it Mrs. Lang? Too, Miss Marple nodded. I believe so. She scrubbed it clean, perhaps fearing it held some trace of her past. But it was the first tin, with Tom's blood, that spoke loudest. It was enough to bring the truth to light. As Mrs. McGillicuddy chattered on, recounting the villagers' reactions, Mrs. Baker's dramatic retellings at the post office, Mrs. Price's insistence on stricter hall oversight, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the broader canvas of St. Mary Mead. The village was a microcosm, its people bound by habit and history, their secrets as inevitable as the changing seasons. She recalled a case from her youth, a stolen locket that had exposed a betrayal. The biscuit tin, in its way, was no different. A small object that had carried a great weight. The evening deepened, and Mrs. McGillicuddy took her leave, promising to return with more gossip. Miss Marple saw her to the door, then returned to her chair by the fire. The scarf for raiment was nearly finished, its grey strands a quiet testament to her steady hands and steadier mind. The biscuit tin mystery had been solved, not through grand heroics, but through the patient observation of human frailties and nervous glance. A scarred hand, a misplaced tin. St. Mary Mead would return to its gentle rhythm, its whispers fading, like the leaves outside. But Miss Marple knew that other secrets waited, hidden in the village's quiet corners. For now, she picked up her needles, the click of their rhythm a counterpoint to the fire's soft song, ready for the next whisper of trouble to stir the air. The end.